Stanford University.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Glad that all of you are here. I'm Shelley Fisher-Fishkin. I'm Director of American Studies, and on behalf of Stanford's American Studies program, it's a real pleasure to welcome you. I'd also particularly like to thank Amy Goodman and Monica Moore from the American Studies program for all their hard work that's made everything come together so smoothly today. Siva Vaidhyanathan is a trenchant and visionary cultural critic and public intellectual. Through groundbreaking books, seminal lectures, dynamic teaching, and stimulating commentary in a broad range of publications, he's leaving his mark on the national and international dialogue about what it takes to sustain a healthy democratic culture. Siva's first book, A Cultural History of Copyright, Copyrights and Copy Wrongs, The Rise of Intellectual Property and How It Threatens Creativity, which came out with NYU Press in 2001, is a major contribution to our understanding of the roots of intellectual property law in the US and its impact on creativity in American literature, film, television, music, and digital content. Publishers Weekly called it simply the best book on the subject. It merges the fields of legal history, cultural history, and communication studies in fresh and innovative ways. Only a cultural historian as creative and resourceful as Siva Vaidhyanathan could produce a book that includes lively discussions of Groucho Marx, Two Live Crew, Jürgen Habermas, Roy Orbison, John Dewey, Mark Twain, Thomas Edison, and Robert Johnson. And although contemporary issues are addressed are as current as this morning's newspaper, the book grounds them in a dauntingly thorough examination of how the founders thought about these questions when they laid the groundwork for the legal system that continues to shape our lives on a daily basis. Its analysis and its conclusions have crucial implications for public policy and for the health of American civic culture. His second book, The Anarchist in the Library, How the Clash Between Freedom and Control is Hacking the Real World and Crashing the System, which came out in 2004, continues his investigation of copyright and creativity into the digital age. Acclaimed by leading scholars in the field, his book has had an important impact on current debates about the value of electronic cultural commons and threats that restrictive intellectual property laws pose to the academy, to the development of scientific knowledge, and to the health of democratic culture generally. The year it came out, the American Association of Law Libraries presented Siva with a certificate of appreciation, quote, for championship of libraries and public education, protecting our cultural democracy, and preserving fair use rights in the digital age, end quote. In addition to the two books I've mentioned and the one he'll be talking about today, Siva co-edited with Carolyn de la Peña, Rewiring the Nation, The Place of Technology in American Studies, a seminal special issue of American Quarterly. Siva is that rarest of creatures, a first-rate scholar who is also a stunningly clear and compelling writer. An indefatigable researcher who's constantly making surprising juxtapositions and syntheses, Siva also has the enviable gift of communicating complex issues with lucidity and grace. In addition to publishing in a range of academic journals, he's also the author of articles in the Chronicle of Higher Education, The Nation, the New York Times magazines, and websites including Open Democracy and Salon. A professor of media studies and law at the University of Virginia, he holds a PhD in American Studies from the University of Texas at Austin, where I taught before coming to Stanford. Indeed, I had the pleasure of being Siva's teacher, in which capacity I learned much more from him than he learned from me. His newest book and the subject of his talk today, The Googlization of Everything and Why We Should Worry, has just come out. Like everything else he writes, it is smart, imaginative, deeply humane, powerful, and beautifully written. Please join me in welcoming a brilliant cultural critic and a dear friend, Siva Vaidhyanathan.
Wow, thanks. Let's go this way. Thank you. You can keep going. That was nice. Now I have to live up to that. I hope I don't disappoint. Thank you very much for coming on this, is it Monday? It's Monday, right? Monday afternoon. I'm still on East Coast time and kind of foggy, so I'll do my best to get through this. My book, The Googlization of Everything, is about us. It's not so much about Google. It's about our relationship with Google. It's about our willingness, our ease, our enthusiasm for folding Google into our lives. I wanted to ask questions like, how did this happen, right? How did we, in such a very short period of time, bake Google into our lives to such a degree that we find it hard to get directions to a restaurant without relying on Google. We find it hard to shop without relying on Google. And this happened almost instantly, right? Google's 12 years old now. Actually, in the fall, it'll be 13. Its voice is just starting to change. And for quite some time, we have enthusiastically adopted Google experiment after Google experiment after Google experiment, all for very good reasons, right? Every one of the experiments that we've used, and I call them experiments because, as Google rolls out different products and services, it's all beta, right? And it's all a way of trying to figure out if we can actually use it in our lives. As we've folded these experiments into our lives, we've done so because Google figured out how to do email in an intuitive and convenient way, and dependable way, right? And in a big way. Google figured out how to do web search and saved the web, made the web useful. Google figured out how to buy a couple companies that could do blogging well and web video well, but still give them credit for identifying the companies and shifting enough stock around to fold things like YouTube and Blogger into the Google universe. Google is about between 60 and 70% of the web search market in the United States. And I use the word market advisedly. It actually has more accurately, it has 60 to 70% of the total searches within the United States are through Google. That doesn't just include the Google site itself, that includes all the other sites that use Google as its home search engines, including many universities and many companies. Still, that's a tremendous amount of usage. And even though Google is very much an American company, we actually use Google at a lower rate than much of the world. In Western Europe, most of the countries in Western Europe give Google about 90% or higher share of web searches. In Portugal and the Netherlands, it's about 96%. That's pretty stunning, and frankly, I don't know why. I don't know why Google is so much more popular in Europe than it is in the United States. I have some guesses, and we can talk more about that if you're interested. The places in the world where Google is making substantial gains include Brazil and India, two very good places to be making substantial gains. And of course, the places where Google is not making substantial gains are just as important. Russia, a lot of the former Soviet republics, China, South Korea, and Japan for very different reasons, and different reasons from each other as well. Of course, the story of Google in China is fascinating, but it's not the whole story of Google's stumbles around the world. So that's the general picture. Let me talk you through some of the questions that occurred to me as I decided to actually take on this subject in a book. Now, if you're interested in Google, and I assume you are, you probably know there are a number of excellent books out there that describe what Google does, tell the story of how Google triumphed. They approach it as the best business journalists would, right? Examining the mistakes, the foibles, the triumphs, the visions, the good luck, and ultimately tell an amazing story of the rise of this company from a couple of grad students here at Stanford dreaming up a neat algorithm and then figuring out a way to turn it into a company, into this institution that has tremendous effects around the world, right? It's an amazing story. Of course, we don't need another book that tells that story, and that's why I didn't want to write another book that tells that story. But what I think we lacked what I thought we lacked when I started researching this book was an account of our relationship, an account of the nature of the transaction. What do we give Google? What does Google give us? What is the deep attraction and the deep affection, the nature of the deep attraction and the deep affection? So in 2006, Yochai Benkler, who's a law professor at Harvard, who was then at Yale, published a very important book called The Wealth of Networks. And this book, you may be familiar with it, it's a rather optimistic account of what he sees as the new political economy. It's a pretty bold book. He, of course, is riffing on the wealth of nations, so it has to be pretty bold, right? But he's essentially arguing that there are important parts of our economy now where scarcity is not the operative function, where abundance is. And there are methods of production that are collaborative and open that are significantly more important than some of the older methods that the older political economy takes account of, right? So he's basically saying, look what happened with Linux, look what happened with Wikipedia. We can imagine 100 other ways that those methods of collaboration, open collaboration, what he calls peer production, can significantly change the world and improve the world. So he's both being analytical and predictive, and normative to some degree. I mean, he certainly approves of this effort. One of the things he was arguing within this book is that the abundance of information and the ability for people like you and me to make sense of the world and comment upon the world and critique the world means that the old problem of too few channels is pretty much over for now. But it may not be over forever. At the very end of his book, he wrote this sentence. And when I read this sentence, it occurred to me that this was actually a scholarly question, right? It's a question that could be answered over time, right? This came out in 2006. We could wait till 2016 and see if it came true. But I decided that this kind of question was worthy of investigation. I wanted to know if Google actually played that strong a filtering role in our lives to the point where it was having inordinate influence over what we learn about the world and how we talk about the world. And I'm happy to report that no, it's not. This was a question in my mind that I focused on throughout, and I can't say that Google restricts our vision of the world to that degree. It does have other interesting effects, though. Now, in 2004, late 2004, Google announced that it had a plan to scan in the entire collection of the University of Michigan Library and significant portions of the libraries of Stanford, Harvard, the New York Public Library, and the Bodleian Library at Oxford. And since that time, the plan to scan in these library collections has expanded significantly, for instance, to include the entire collection of Stanford, but also has expanded to more than 60 universities and national libraries around the world. It may be higher than that, actually. When that plan was announced, it struck me as pretty audacious for a couple of reasons. One, what the heck, an entire university library available through Google search? That's kind of mind-blowing. And a lot of people thought that at the time, right? Mind-blowing in a positive way, but I also thought, this may not be the way we want to proceed here. At the time, Google was 6 years old in 2004. At the time, Google had been around for less time than Brad Pitt and Jennifer Aniston had been married, right? The universities Google was dealing with were many hundreds of years old. And this seemed upside down to me. Why would universities with all of the collections, all of the wisdom, all of the knowledge, all of the expertise in their library staffs want to contract with a 6-year-old company to act as the custodian for hundreds of years of knowledge? It seemed off. Now, I'd been working a lot with the library communities over the previous years, and I knew that for 15 years before that time, there had been efforts and ideas to do large-scale digital projects within and among these different libraries. But I also knew that there was a coordination problem. No one had figured out how to get libraries to work together on a unified collection. No one had even discussed unifying standards for such a project. And no one had been able to raise the money it would take to do digitization at that scale. So I understood why university libraries were so excited, many of them were so excited about engaging with Google on this level. But I also knew from talking to a lot of librarians, rank and file librarians mostly, that there were big challenges here. That Google was unlikely to care about things like user privacy and confidentiality to the extent that librarians must. I knew that Google was unlikely to pay attention to the quality of scans to the extent that librarians should and would, right? That the quality of the scans was not going to be archive level, right? They wouldn't be preservation level scans. And I suspected, although I didn't know for sure until much later, that there were going to be all sorts of other problems like metadata problems. But basically, I thought this whole thing was put together in haste. And I couldn't understand why haste was such an important factor, right? Why the urge to do this fast was so much more important than the desire to do it right. And by it, I mean create essentially a globally available digital collection, whether that meant a searchable collection or an entire full text collection. I thought, here's an opportunity to actually have at least a nationwide, if not global, conversation about what sort of digital collection we might build in this world. We might envision a global digital library that can connect people in the poorest parts of the world to all of the fabulous information that you and I get to share. That's a pretty amazing dream. That's like a mind-blowing idea. We actually have the technology to do it. If it's desirable enough, maybe we can build the political will to do it. But I was concerned that this project that Google had launched was short-circuiting any effort to think about it in those terms. Instead, we had gone for the quick fix that would be on Google's terms. So I said, I've got to make sense of this company, right? I used Google like everybody else did. Google was my favorite search engine. I think I started in 1998. I'm sure I heard about it from some tech email list or some really brilliant person I know who followed all things webby had told me about it. So I had been a big fan since 1998, since anybody was. And I also knew that Google was one of the few big rich companies that was fighting the good fight in copyright, right? They were very invested in protecting users' rights because users' rights are also Google's rights in terms of the ability to make copies without the impediment, right? Without having to get lawyers involved in negotiating every contract. Google had a vested interest in making sure that information on the web was as open and flowed as easily as possible. So I had always thought of Google as one of the good guys. I knew a lot of people who had gone off to work for Google. I knew many more who wanted to work for Google. So I clearly thought of it as a sort of model workplace as well. But I decided around this time that I better start looking at what actually is going on at Google, why Google does what it does. And this is, of course, Google's mission statement: to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible. This struck me as beyond audacious. I said, what kind of company would adopt this as its mission statement? What kind of company would adopt this as its mission statement years before it figured out how to make $1? That struck me as odd. It struck me as kind of cool, but still odd. So I decided this is just too interesting. I have to keep going with this. And this was long before I decided to write a book about it. I came across an interview where Sergey Brin, one of the co-founders, had been asked by an interviewer, by a journalist, what would the perfect search engine be like? And he said, it would be like the mind of God. Well, this is when I decided to write a book, because I figured that is beyond audacious. This is beyond hubris. This is blasphemous, actually. But this is, by the way, a Google image search of the mind of God, in case you ever wondered. This is what Google will tell you the mind of God looks like. It occurred to me that there was something else going on here. This is not a run-of-the-mill company. On the other hand, it's a company, right? So what is it about the vision of the people running Google? What is it about the collective vision of the people working at Google? But more importantly, what is it about our reaction to Google? What is our relationship with Google? That's what really drove me. Now, Google is, of course, omnipresent, right? It's in every cultural conversation we have as a noun or as a verb. It's omnipotent, right? It's figured out how to make money on the web when very few companies have actually figured out how to make money on the web. And it's omniscient. It knows a tremendous amount about us, even if we know a lot less about it. And of course, it claims to be benevolent. So what's going on here? Well, this "don't be evil" motto, which we're all very familiar with, plays a fascinating role in the company and in our relationship with the company as well. When I first started looking at the company, I wanted to put this to the side. I didn't want to take it seriously, right? The pledge not to be evil. And it's part of the lore of Google, that it's part of the story that you get every time you read a journalistic account of Google's rise. Almost every op-ed about Google quotes it, mostly to say, but aha, it's doing X, Y, and Z wrong, therefore it's violating its motto, right? I didn't want to play that game. That's not an interesting game to me. I was invited to be part of this a debate that NPR puts on, that they produce in New York. It's like an Oxbridge-style debate. And the question was, resolved, Google violates its motto, don't be evil. And I had to think for a couple of minutes whether I wanted to do it, because I don't really care about the motto as a test. To me, it's unhelpful to say, oh, but look what Google's doing in China, therefore it's violating its motto. Or, look what Google's doing with privacy, therefore it's violating its motto. That's just a game. The real question for me was, what is at root here, right? So when I participated in this debate, I said, well, one of the things we have to do, if you're not familiar with Oxbridge-style debates, the whole idea is actually to be funny and entertaining in a way that ends up being convincing, to take the question on its own terms rather than worry about larger truths. So I understood this as sort of a game show. And I decided that one of the contribution I'll make is actually try to get to the essence of what we might mean by evil, help define it. So I went through the 7 deadly sins, and I gave this sort of tongue-in-cheek set of examples of how Google violates every single one of the 7 deadly sins. Lust, well, they have massages, right? So, but I didn't really mean any of it except for the last one, superbia. Superbia is the 7th of the 7 deadly sins. It basically means hubris, right? It means a vision that is almost godlike, a vision of oneself that is almost godlike. It is the deadliest of the 7 deadly sins. It is, after all, the sin that Lucifer commits, which is why Lucifer falls. I'm getting all this from Paradise Lost, of course. So I maintain to this day that that is the sin that matters. That's the sin that matters when we deal with this company. But what is it about us, again, our relationship with Google? Why do we have such blind faith in Google? And it was blinder then, right? It was blinder 5 or 6 years ago when I started looking into this than it is now. Now we have a pretty, I think, a much more realistic vision of how Google works in the world, largely because Google's expanded into so many different areas that it's caused friction. It's caused a tremendous amount of anxiety for itself and for others. But before Google started expanding in all these different areas, messing with different markets, when it was merely making sense of the web to us, which was wonderful, we certainly had a sense of blind faith in it. And we had a sense of love. And I think a lot of people still do, right? There's still a lot of love out there. And I found this baffling. And when I first started writing short pieces explaining why I had problems with the book search process, and my problems were varied. I had problems with the fact that actually my bigger problems were with the university libraries not standing up for the values of librarianship when engaging with Google in these contracts. I had nothing against what Google wants to do. So from my point of view, Google should do what's good for Google. Let's just not pretend that what's good for Google is always good for us, or good for libraries, or good for researchers in all cases. But I was disappointed that university libraries had not negotiated from a stronger position early on, that they were so eager to rush into this deal. And what I found when I was writing pieces critical of the deal was people I respected tremendously could not believe that I was raising issues about Google, because after all, Google's one of the good guys, right? And I was really shocked that there was this level of adoration out there. I didn't think it was possible to love a company, right? I mean, I've pretty much single-handedly kept this company afloat through some tough times, and I know a lot of people who are major Apple cult people, but I don't know that there's love. I certainly don't feel it. There's product loyalty, but loyalty is not necessarily love. And so I really felt like this was the agape kind of love, not an eros kind of love. But it struck me that there were some big questions to ask here. And part of the thing that I noticed was that one of the reasons that Google makes us feel so good is that Google gives us what we think we want. It satisfies our demand so quickly and easily and doesn't charge us anything, right? It's easy to love Google because Google doesn't ask for our money. Comcast asks for our money. We hate Comcast, right? I hate Comcast. Everybody hates. I don't know anybody who doesn't hate Comcast, except the handful of people who work for Comcast. And that makes sense, right? But there's more to it. So what's working there, right? Are we even Google's customers? Well, no, of course not. We're not Google's customers because Google doesn't ask for our money. We're Google's product. Google sells our attention to advertisers. That's not special or new. That's what Fox does with my attention every Sunday when it tries to sell me to beer companies and pickup truck companies or whatever. But what's added to this is the fact that we're essentially Google's worker bees too. We do a tremendous amount of interaction with Google in a way that constantly improves Google. So our relationship is special. And one of the reasons that we are so attached to Google is it makes everything faster. Everything's faster. And this mattered a tremendous amount before around 2003 when we started to see widespread adoption of broadband in residences in the United States and Europe. Before that time, when most people dialed up to get to the web, speed mattered quite a bit more. The fact that Google's simple interface loaded faster mattered quite a bit more. But even today, the user studies that Google talks about when it talks about how it improves its products focus on the fact that Google delivers results a split second faster than any other comparable service, and that's always mattered. People have demonstrated their appreciation for that split second. It's kind of like when someone gets on the elevator and keeps pushing the button, hoping that it'll get there faster. That struck me as really weird and worthy of examination. But I also wanted to get in some overtly political questions about Google. In the summer of 2009, Eric Schmidt, who until recently was the CEO of Google, was speaking at the Aspen Ideas Festival. And he gave one of his standard speeches, visionary things about how the web's going to change the world, blah, blah, blah. And afterwards, a radio journalist from New York stood up and said, well, Eric, I'm wondering about Google's role in the world right now. It seems like it plays such a dominant role in the world of information. Do you think we're at the point now where we might want to consider regulating it like we regulate public utilities? And this is the Aspen Ideas Festival, and if you haven't been, and I haven't been, it's filled with the smartest people around, or at least the richest people around, or the richest smart people around, or whatever they can find, and a whole lot of journalists, right? Most of them write for The Atlantic or something. And again, I never get invited. Maybe you do. So everyone laughs at this question, right? It was so absurd, such a crazy thing to ask about regulating Google. And of course, Eric Schmidt responds with, well, you won't be surprised to know that I think we should not regulate Google. And then he goes on to say, well, we tried the planned economy in the 20th century and it didn't work out so well in the Soviet Union. And again, this was summer of 2009, a year and a half after the greatest economic crash since the Great Depression. We had already confronted the notion that it's never as simple as regulate or deregulate, right? So this radio journalist, fortunately, he saw through this and he said, wait a minute, that's an insufficient answer. Because after all, we're not talking about a planned economy. We're not talking about the Soviet Union versus a free market. We're talking about whether there's a necessary level of regulation that we might need for such an important thing as a company that has such a tremendous influence over the flow of information in the world. And the question is, what should we do about it? Now, of course, the question itself isn't a full question, and the answer that Schmidt gave is insufficient as well. And the reason it's insufficient is he could have answered it in a much defter way. He could have said, regulate what part of my business is not regulated. And that, I think, is the honest answer. Because, look, Google has thousands of people working on regulatory questions. Hundreds of them are high-paid lawyers, right? And they deal with regulatory systems like copyright, the most pervasive cultural regulatory system we have. It touches everything Google does. People who work on patents, another regulatory system. People who work on trademarks, a third regulatory system. Because Google's a publicly traded company, they have to deal with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Because Google deals in the mobile phone world, they have to deal with the FCC. Because Google deals with broadband, they have to deal with the FCC. Because Google deals with electricity, they have to deal with the Energy Department and state utility regulators as well. Google buys insurance. Google has to deal with the Federal Trade Commission because just about every business in the world deals with the Federal Trade Commission. The fact is there is no such thing as a free market, and Eric Schmidt knows it. There is no such thing as an unregulated tech company, and Eric Schmidt knows it. And he would have been much better off, and I think much more honest, if he had just said, you should see what I'm paying to deal with regulation here, right? And that's the straight up answer. Instead, it becomes this ephemeral discussion, regulation yes or no, which doesn't help us and doesn't get us anywhere. And part of what I was trying to do with this book is get to the better question. Are we regulating Google and other similar companies the right way? Are we over-regulating? I happen to think we're over-regulating in areas like copyright. Are we under-regulating? I happen to think we're under-regulating in areas like antitrust. Now, I could be wrong about both of those things, and we could have a wonderful debate in this country over what sorts of copyright and antitrust systems would actually create both competitive environments for companies like this, preserving innovation, and maintain reward for investors and creativity. We could, but we're not, because we're stuck in this binary between what's imagined to be a libertarian paradise and what's imagined to be a socialist nightmare, when nobody lives in either of those places, least of all Google. One of the things I noticed as I was looking through how people wrote and thought about Google was this weird assumption that Google actually sort of rose out of brilliance, the brilliance of the people who worked there, the vision of the founders, the deft leadership of Eric Schmidt coming over from Sun, right? This story, to me, was fairly incomplete. What was missing from this story was the fact that, for instance, Sergey Brin and Larry Page figured out how to, well, Larry Page specifically worked on a grant from the National Science Foundation to come up with the algorithm that became PageRank, right? So we paid for that. and that's missing from the official story. Well, it's not missing from the official story. Certainly Google doesn't hide that. But it's missing from the general public acknowledgement of how Google grew into what it is. And that's not the only example when we're dealing with this particular industry, right? This is an industry built largely on the backs of public investment. Some rather smart and visionary public investment that we've made through things like the National Science Foundation, things like NASA, things like Stanford University, right? All funded heavily by the public, all involved with creating an environment that can create so much creativity and boldness. And yet we ignore that because we focus on the libertarian dream. And that was a major motivation for this. Well, Schmidt, after he was asked that second question, came up with this answer. And I apologize for Eric Schmidt's lack of discipline in his answer. But basically what he's saying here, if you don't want to read the whole thing, is we don't need to worry about regulating Google because after all, we are trustworthy. You know, we are a good company. We wouldn't lead you astray. He's basically arguing that Google's sense of responsibility, its sense of social responsibility, is baked into the company itself. That companies are, how does he say it? Companies are defined by the values that they were founded with and that they operate with today. Boy, I hope that's not true of Ford, by the way. But in that sense, I mean, he's essentially invoking don't be evil without saying don't be evil. And by the way, you'll almost never hear a Google official say don't be evil. That's something that the rest of us say about Google, but Google never says it about itself because it's a trap, right? But he is basically saying that Google's role in the world is so positive that Google should have a pass on the regulatory question. And this is a pretty consistent move that Google officials make. The other move Google officials make is to say, hey, if you have a problem with what we do, you can just opt out, right? You have a problem with the fact that Street View caught your kid running naked in a fountain, you can just tell us and we'll remove it. You have a problem with the fact that Street View caught you coming out of a house of prostitution at 2 in the afternoon and your partner found out about it? So sorry, just tell us, we'll take it down, right? Even after the damage is done. Or Google will say, well, if you're an author and you have a problem with your book being scanned in by Google and put on the index for Google Books, just tell us and we'll take it down, right? The default is everything's included. The default is always in Google's favor. and the burden is on the person who may have suffered something, may have suffered some harm or indignity. But it's always about opting out, right? It's never about being asked to opt in. It's always about opting out. That's the default. That's move number 2 that Google makes when being held to account. The move number 3 is to say competition's just a click away. And that very phrase is almost a mantra for Google officials, along with privacy is very important to Google. You'll hear that 100 different times. Now, this notion of competition being a click away is also not a realistic response, because no other search engine company can come close to Google in terms of its reach and in terms of its assets. No other search engine company can truly compete, because Google is not just code. It's not just a collection of smart people writing brilliant code and running it for the rest of us. If it were that simple, remember Cool? Do you remember the search engine Cool? Well, maybe not, right? A few people remember it. Remember the week that everyone was talking about Cool, right? Cool was a search engine founded by a number of ex-Google employees who decided that they could do it better. And they had some brilliant notions, I've been told. It was hard to use a search engine because once Cool announced that it was going live, enough people, it may have been 500, it may have been 5 million, decided to use the search engine on the same day, and boom, it was over, right? It totally crashed, thus becoming a laughingstock almost immediately. That never happens at Google. And there's a reason it never happens at Google, because Google is about infrastructure. From day one, Google has made sure that it had the processing power, the server space, the bandwidth, the redundancy to make sure that crashes are few and far between. Every 3 or 4 months, there's a little bit of an outage with Gmail, right? You probably experienced that. Maybe it doesn't even happen every 3 or 4 months anymore. It did for a while. And when it happens, you'll see a bunch of tweets about it. Oh, Gmail's down, right? As if life is over. And usually it's back up within an hour or two. Rarely is there some major phenomenon, but what happens often when people complain about that is people will say, well, what are you worried about? You didn't pay anything for it, which is, I guess, a fair response. But competition's not a click away, because competition isn't real. There's realistically no other company that has the sunken infrastructure that Google has, right? The acres of server farms, the tremendous amount of fiber optic cable, the processing power, and 12 years of data. That 12 years of data, that 12 years of human behavior that Google has right now, global accounts of human behavior, human desires, human expression, that is gold to Google. That is how Google constantly changes and improves its system, because it's all about feedback. So the question is not, as another author has posed, is Google making us dumber? In fact, the question is, how are we making Google smarter? And we're making Google smarter with every click. With every click, we make Google better able to serve us, better able to guess what we're doing. So those are the 3 ways that Google sort of dodges the regulation question. I find each of those an inadequate response for various reasons. Now, Google has 3 different models of content delivery. 3 different ways that it sends us stuff. And I want to argue that each of these different models or levels demands a different level of responsibility on behalf of the company, and therefore a different approach in terms of regulatory oversight. The first is what I call rank and link. Think about search. In search, what Google's doing is basically just going around and making copies of content that sits on third-party servers. Servers Google does not control, content that Google does not order up. In this case, Google bears almost no responsibility, the minimal level of responsibility for what goes on in the web, right? Think of all the crazy, ugly, horrible stuff on the web. We really don't want to hold Google responsible for all that stuff, right? All that porn, all that hate speech, all that spam. In fact, if anything, Google does us a great favor by minimizing our likelihood of encountering that stuff through web search. Google's very good at embedding those values that minimize the availability of porn, minimize the availability of malware, into its basic search algorithms, right? That's how Google has now built itself, to make the web a cleaner, friendlier, more dependable medium. But nonetheless, that's just a favor Google does us. We should not necessarily want Google to be held legally liable for all the crazy stuff out there because, as I said, Google didn't order it up and doesn't host it on its servers. But there's a second model of content delivery. Think about YouTube. In this case, Google's not ordering up the content, but Google is hosting the content on its servers. This is a much higher level of responsibility. Google doesn't ask us to put our dogs on skateboards. We just put our dogs on skateboards, right? So Google's, of course, folding the YouTube content and blogger content into its collection of material that it has about us, and it's folding a lot of this into search results as well, especially YouTube. And of course, it requires registration, meaning that if you are, well, it requires registration to upload to YouTube, not to consume. But that means, of course, that it's attracting a larger number of what I think of as Google Power users. If you register with any Google service, you're giving Google a much richer account of your interactions with us. So this is the second level. And then the highest level is what I call capture and serve. In this case, Google is actively going out into the world and creating digital content where there is not already digital content. So think about Street View, think about the Books program. In both cases, Google is not saying, we're just using our server space for whatever you want to do. We're actually going out and deciding what to digitize, how to hold it on our servers, how to serve it up through search, and so forth. This is the highest level of responsibility. In this case, Google is most definitely a publisher in the classic sense of the word, and therefore has all of the liabilities and responsibilities of a publisher. But of course, Google argues in almost every case when it gets into some friction that it wants a single standard, the lowest standard, the standard for search, that opt-out thing. In every case, Google will say, Street View, for instance, as I said, what's the problem? Just tell us, we'll get rid of it. What's the problem with having a YouTube video that embarrasses someone or libels someone? Just tell us it's a problem, we'll take it down. We don't have to scour all of the YouTube videos up front and decide what's good and what's bad. And in fact, I don't think Google should. I think that middle level is a very interesting regulatory problem, but I actually think Google should have the pretty low level of responsibility for it. In fact, Google takes more responsibility than it probably has to. At YouTube, there are actually people whose job it is to screen for the most horrible stuff. For reasons I can't quite figure out, people keep trying to upload hours and hours of porn to YouTube. I don't understand the motivation for doing this at all. It's not like there's a lack of availability of porn, but for some reason people think that it would be fun or funny to get porn onto YouTube. So of course, there are people at YouTube who are constantly making sure that the stuff doesn't get up there. That's one of the reasons why there's a delay every time you upload a video, because somebody or a computer or some combination has to screen for it. So Google actually does do a minimal level of screening of content on YouTube. Nonetheless, in some of Google services, it's a network or a conduit, and in other Google services, it is a publisher, right? And Google wants to make the claim that it is a lot less than a publisher, and I want to make the claim that it, of course, in some cases, is exactly that. Now, here's the thing. Even in search, Google is not neutral. There's no such thing as a neutral algorithm, first of all. Every algorithm has values baked into them. Every algorithm has results that may or may not be decent. This is a search I did in the, well, it was July, this is the moon landing, of 2010. And this one is done from my house in Charlottesville, Virginia on Google.com, and this is done from my house in Charlottesville, Virginia on Google.de, the German version. And you can see the major difference is that anti-Semitic content shows up on the US one and does not in the German one. Easily explained by the fact that distributing such content in Germany is against the law. Distributing such content in the United States is not against the law. Now, the first result is a Wikipedia entry about the word Jew and the word Judaism. The second entry, this is kind of a combined result. And as I said, this is summer 2010, so Google has changed its interface quite seriously, and the next slide shows the very same search done this morning. JewWatch News has been, since about 2002, either the first or second result for this search. JewWatch News is a rather nasty, not that there's a non-nasty, anti-Semitic site. And for a number of years, JewWatch News, as I said, was #1. It was also very highly ranked in many other searches dealing with Jewish issues, with Judaism, or with the Holocaust. And the reason was that anti-Semites had been essentially structuring their links to take advantage of Google's algorithms to drive JewWatch News higher and higher in search results for Jewish-related subjects. And the one victory it had was for the word Jew. It helps that the word Jew is in the title. So this has been a problem for Google for a number of years. It doesn't look good for the company. It's not good for the rest of us. But it's really hard for Google to deal with this highly motivated, technologically savvy group of anti-Semites who, I guess, like most anti-Semites, don't have jobs or dates or anything. So they have a lot of time to do these sorts of collections of links. Now, this isn't the only example of Google bombing. You're probably familiar with the Google bomb of miserable failure, which would yield George W. Bush's official site, which is no longer the top hit anymore. And now it's the Wikipedia article explaining that particular phenomenon. And I had the pleasure of giving a similar talk to this at the University of Pennsylvania on Tuesday, and I got to remind them that Rick Santorum was once their senator, and that's a really nasty Google bomb result, and I don't encourage you to type in Santor, I'm sorry, yeah. Anyway, so in 2003, the Anti-Defamation League went to visit Google to talk about this issue. And Sergey Brin met with them, and no one would be more sensitive to this issue than Mr. Brin. His family had escaped from the Soviet Union in the 70s. He was quite sensitive and familiar with this issue. But he convinced the Anti-Defamation League that Google's algorithms can't be blamed for this, because this is, after all, a reflection of the web. It's all about those incoming links to these pages. This is just a case of the web being ugly. But Google itself didn't make this happen. And the Anti-Defamation League accepted his explanation. Google made a couple of moves in the wake of this controversy. First of all, you'll see at the top there's a yellow bar. It says offensive search results. If you click on that, you get an explanation, a defense, where Google basically says, it's the computers, it's not us. In addition, Google, of course, doesn't sell any ads next to this search because, of course, it doesn't want to make any money off of this. This is what that offensive search result, part of what that offensive search result tab will reveal. A site's ranking in Google's search result relies heavily on computer algorithms. Actually, for years it said relies exclusively on computer algorithms. It's been changed to relies heavily, using thousands of factors to calculate a page's relevance. Of course, who decides what factor outranks another factor? Human beings. And then it says, the beliefs and preferences of those who work at Google, as well as the opinions of the general public, do not determine or impact our search results. This has never been true, and it's less true now. So here's what that search looks like this morning, done in, actually I'm staying at the lovely faculty club here. I did it on the Stanford network. I actually logged out of my Google account, so Google didn't know it was me doing the search, in case I'd done the search enough times that Google might have learned over time that this is what it wanted. This is what I wanted, and that's another change that's gone on. So this is as straightforward a set of results as possible. You'll see the Wikipedia entry is still first, but now it's for JEWS. It's changed slightly, and JewWatch News is still second. We also get Henry Ford's book, The International Jew, and then we get Borat's Throw the Jew Down the Well, which of course is not actually anti-Semitic, but it certainly feels like it if you're not part of the inside joke. But basically this hasn't changed very much, right? So the offensive search result explanation is now no longer a banner across the top, but it is the only ad here, but it still accomplishes the same thing. Now, my point of showing this is, first of all, and comparing it with the German version, is to show that, yes, actually, human beings do make decisions at Google, what goes in and what goes out. Human beings determine what the algorithm cares about, and thus the values therein. Now, it's not just the computers, right? It is the people at Google, not that they want JewWatch News to be the second search, they don't, but the decisions they make about what matters in the algorithm keep it there. And Google's been called to public account on this very question a number of times. So last year, 2010, in the fall of 2010, someone noticed that the top Google image search for Michelle Obama was a racist caricature. It was dominant. And once someone alerted Google to this, Google removed the image from its index, essentially taking it out, which it could do with JewWatch News. And then someone pointed out on a blog, hey, wait a minute, Google didn't make that adjustment for JewWatch News, but did for this racist caricature Michelle Obama. What's going on here? And almost instantly, the caricature reappeared in the index, and once again remained at the top of the rankings for images for Michelle Obama. Meaning that every 8th grader doing a report on Michelle Obama is going to find this image. In recent weeks, it's still in the index, last time I checked, but it's low in the rankings. So they've altered the algorithm for image search to drive Michelle Obama's picture down without removing it. Not her picture, but the caricature, the racist caricature. Now, also in recent weeks, Google has made a rather explicit declaration. This was on the official Google blog about 6 weeks ago. And Google's been dealing with the fact that there are a lot of junk sites out there that scrape news from legitimate news sites and repackage it, and then use tricks of search engine optimization to drive traffic to these content farms, they're known as. There are also content farms that pay people, very minimal fees to just write junk, and again, put a great headline on it, tweak everything to optimize results in Google, and this drives what we might think of as legitimate news services lower in a lot of the searches, both in Google News and Google Web Search. And so Google decided they're going to restructure the algorithms to, as they say, reduce the rankings for low-quality sites and provide better rankings for high-quality sites. But who's to say what's what? I don't happen to think the San Francisco Chronicle is a high-quality site. That's just me, right? I think a lot of people agree. But where is it on this, right? Is it low quality or high quality? Is Huffington Post low quality or high quality? Who's to say? Well, of course, Google employees are to say. Here is a set of Google employees basically making a judgment over the value of content in direct contradiction to this statement. Google's changing in a lot of different ways. For the last 2 years, Google's been doing personalized search results by default. That means that Google's dossier about you influences what Google will predict you're interested in. And this has a lot of virtue, right? For instance, if you happen to be really into English cars and your friend happens to be really into South American jungle cats and you both search for Jaguar, you're going to get results that actually reflect your particular interests. That's nice, right? It's called user satisfaction. Google's search results are also increasingly localized. That's why I let you know where I was sitting when I did those searches. Because if I'm doing a search in Charlottesville for a term and you're doing the very same search here in Palo Alto, you're going to get potentially different results. My favorite example for this is a person sitting in Chicago, a person sitting in Boston, both type in SOX into the search boxes. Google knows that the person sitting in Chicago is more likely to want the White Sox and the person in Boston is more likely to like the Red Sox, right? But again, simple illustration, but the idea of localization has been around for a while. Personalization is much more intense and has been going on for the last 2 years, and Google's constantly ramping it up. What this does is, of course, narrow our field of vision because Google is now, we're outsourcing our filtering and our decision making to Google exponentially, right? And it's able to essentially narrow our field of vision in a way that's much better for shopping, but I would assert much worse for learning. If we're dealing with, shopping for cars, right, and we type in Jaguar, that's great. It's going to make sure that we get what we think we want. As my wife says, Google seems to read her mind. And that's part of the great satisfaction of it. That's why we trust it so much, because it's almost never wrong. You probably can't remember the last time you got ridiculous search results from Google. For that matter, oh, maybe you do. Okay, good. Maybe you probably can't remember the last time you got ridiculous, inappropriate ads from Google either. The ways of guessing the appropriateness of ads to us is so good that that's actually why Google makes so much money. You probably can't go 10 minutes without finding ridiculous, inappropriate Facebook ads, right? Facebook hasn't figured out how to do the ad targeting as well as Google. The other day, I wrote something on Facebook making fun of Newt Gingrich, and I got a ton of Republican ads all of a sudden because they saw the word Gingrich and they assumed I must be writing something positive about Newt Gingrich. I've never met anyone who wrote anything positive about Newt Gingrich, but anyway, there you go. The problem was, of course, it put up a big picture of George Allen, my former senator, the Santorum of Virginia. So it just Facebook hasn't figured this out the way Google has. But as I said, it's great for shopping. It's not so great for learning. If you're doing something complex, if you're trying to work your way through a complex scientific issue, if you're trying to even figure out the nature of a malady, whether you should go see a physician, Google's not likely to give you a broad vision. It's likely to drill down and echo back what you've already expressed. Right? And this is not necessarily the best way to explore the world. For that reason, what I would like us to do is actually get this, grasp this, go with it, and say, thank goodness Google is improving my consumption. I need help consuming. Actually, I probably don't need help consuming. But, let's just go with that and accept it. But let's also recognize the limitations and say, there are going to be moments when I don't want to turn to Google for not even the last answer, maybe not even the first answer. Right? And so my only prescription here is a sense of critical awareness and distance to deflate the notion of trust and worship in the company, to encourage competition through legal intervention as well as market intervention. I think we should experiment with other search engines. We should make sure that we actually elect people who support antitrust laws, for instance. And we should also recognize that Google's not going to give us the best possible answer for all situations. Now, Google does rely heavily on corporate social responsibility in its ethic, right, in its public face. And I would like to deflate this notion as well. And this is actually going to be the subject of my next book, because I'm really concerned that we've fallen for corporate social responsibility a little bit too hard. Corporate social responsibility became a major factor in American life in the 1960s. In the wake of the Civil Rights Movement, when consumer action played a part in opening up important avenues and businesses in the South, when it was clear that companies like Coca-Cola could actually do something good for its own image by being on the right side of civil rights, that made a tremendous difference. And there was a lot of discussion in the late 1960s, especially through the environmental movement, that companies could pledge to behave better and thus attract more market share and actually, satisfy a broader set of stakeholders than merely shareholders. Milton Friedman wrote an article in 1970 in which it was called "The Social Responsibility of Businesses to Increase Its Profits." This was in the New York Times Magazine, and it caused quite a bit of an uproar, because he basically argued that this whole movement for corporate social responsibility is misguided, that it by introducing these other values, it distorts the price signals in the marketplace. It prevents markets from reaching the optimal prices, that it was a great distraction for companies, and that they really should, that society would be better if companies just did what they did to maximize shareholder return. And he was attacked mostly from the left. A lot of people were offended at this rather amoral approach to business. But quickly, the libertarians in this country took on this article as a foil as well. And so what you see through the 1970s in libertarian literature is the rise of the notion that, look, we have pollution, like it or not. Lake Erie burned, right? You can't do anything about that. You can't wish it away. We have a problem. We have dirty air. We have dirty water. Either we're going to say, that's fine, let's live with it, head in the sand, familiar argument these days, or we're going to have to come up with a way to deal with it. Maybe we can come up with a market-based way to deal with it, right? Maybe we can ask the market to reward companies that don't pollute, for instance. Maybe we can ask the market to reward companies that don't discriminate. Maybe we can ask the market to reward companies that try to do good things through philanthropy, through their image in the world, right? Because the alternative is to invite the state in. Remember, between 1971 and 1973, we see the passage of, the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency, the passage of the Clean Water Act, the passage of the Clean Air Act, all things that libertarians recoiled about, right? So the very notion that you could actually address complex problems through market choices becomes very attractive. Now, of course, all that's going on within the libertarian literature in the 70s and early 80s is boiling at a very low rate. It's not really affecting much of how we think about politics in those days. But by the late 1980s, you start to see people like John Mackey, the CEO of Whole Foods, embrace this quite overtly and argue explicitly against Friedman's position. And this becomes almost common sense within corporate America by the 1980s. And you can see a lot of it at work just down the road in Silicon Valley. But there's a problem here, and it's a problem that I call public failure. Now, we're pretty familiar with market failure. It's a classic idea that there can be a public good that markets can't satisfy. And so we have to ask the state to step in to correct for it. That's why we have public television. That's why we have public radio, for instance. We don't talk much about market failure anymore, right? When people defend funding for PBS, it's all about how much they really like Car Talk and not really about the fact that Car Talk wouldn't exist if it were a market function. But I want to introduce the notion of public failure. Public failure is an idea in which a public institution, which we think we should rely on, is denatured and defunded to the point where it cannot function. And this is essentially what's happening with our information ecosystem. This is what's happening with our public libraries. This is what's happening with our universities. This is what's happening with our public schools. This is what's happening with a number of different institutions, and I would put public broadcasting in here as well. The constant defunding of it to the point where it can't always function as we would hope. And so we see moves like Google's move into the book project as an opportunity to capitalize on a vacuum that the library community had, if it had been adequately funded, could have moved into earlier. Now, that's not a tragic thing. That's not the worst thing in the world. It's kind of clever that I put that together, blah, blah, blah. But it's really tragic when it comes to something like disaster relief, right? So after Hurricane Katrina, when the federal government and the state government in Louisiana were unable to deliver water to people who needed water because both relief systems had been systematically dismantled, intentionally dismantled and defunded, and people were dying, Walmart saved lives. Walmart rolled the trucks in, right? Took advantage of the public failure and was able, again, to save lives, thank goodness. Within the libertarian literature, oddly, this has turned into a story to learn from. That we may not want to have elaborate bureaucracies to deal with disaster relief. We might actually want to do these sort of instant ad hoc contracts and rely on companies like Walmart to bring its clearly superior systems into play to deal with disaster relief. So this is something I'm very worried about. And as I said, this is something I'm going to be writing about extensively in my next work. But really what we see here is Google on the web as Caesar. A largely benevolent Caesar, right? Caesar was actually pretty popular in Rome, except for the handful of people who stabbed him. And what are you going to do, right? There's always somebody who wants to stab you. Before Google rose to make sense of the web for us, before Google made the web clean, and it really did, made the web dependable, livable, kind of cute, the web was really scary and unworkable. It was not so long ago that people were, I think, legitimately wary of engaging with the web at a large scale. Remember when you were afraid to do your banking on the web, right? It took a lot of institutional support and investment to sort of train us out of that hesitation. And Google was a big part of it. That actually had more to do with encryption, the banking part. But nonetheless, the very notion that the web, you could spend hours with your child on your lap in front of the web, that was impossible to imagine in 2001 or 2000, right? Because every third site seemed to be pornography, for instance. What we have now, though, is Google is essentially the sovereign of the web. Google is ruling the web for us. And that's not necessarily bad, but I think it's something we have to acknowledge, especially as we see the web change and we see Google change. Because in 10 years, I can guarantee this company will not be what it was 10 years ago or even what it is today. I can pretty much guarantee you that the web won't look like the web in 10 years. I can pretty much guarantee it's going to play a different role in our lives, and this company will play a different role in our lives. And the people who run the company now, they won't be running the company in 10 years or 20 years. Maybe 10 years, but not 20 years, right? And for that reason and that reason alone, I think we should hesitate to entrust it with things beyond its core business. And I certainly don't think we should engage in projects that lay so much trust upon what is, after all, just another publicly traded company. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that wonderful talk, very stimulating talk. I think we have time for some questions.
So my question is actually, if you see the opt-out default model being picked up by people imitating Google in other spheres. And I'll give you a concrete example, okay, that's probably one I shouldn't mention here, but I'll mention it anyway. So I was surprised that the Stanford Library is the first university library I've used that doesn't sort of default to absolute protection of borrower privacy.
Really?
You opt out of having borrower information available if people are looking for a book and you happen to have it checked out. So I'm curious if the sort of reliance on an opt-out rather than opt-in model is something you see being picked up in a lot of other places or sectors that Google has had a footprint in.
Beyond the web, right? I mean, Facebook does it too. Beyond the web, no, I haven't really seen it, but I'd like to know more about this. The way you describe it, though, now, so if you're using the catalog and you come across a book, if I understand this correctly.
It's for stuff you currently have checked out. It's not like all borrower records.
So they're asking you to opt out of privacy.
You are by default, you would have to go to opt out and fill out a form. The default is that your information, is available if someone's looking for the thing.
Is that right?
Checked out.
Wow. Okay, that's kind of scary. I was not aware of this. I have a different problem at the University of Virginia, which is because, as with many university libraries, Google Books is heavily integrated with our library catalog. And when I'm using the straight-up university catalog, I'm confident that there's no cookie in my browser, that they're not tracking my searches, not making a record of my searches, even though you have to click a lot to figure that out. But I'm pretty hip with this stuff, so I assume that I'm not. But then there's always a little bug saying you can view this book on Google Books. If I click on it, I'm transported to Google Books, where, of course, cookie goes in my browser. There's constant monitoring of my activities, but there's no warning. And I've been arguing with my library that there really has to be a warning. There has to be a box that pops up and says, beware, you're about to enter a commercial system where your usage will be tracked and someone's going to follow you everywhere you go. I think that would be really healthy, just if not for no other reason, giving people the confidence that the library's not doing that. But I'm a little bit so that's my only answer to that. So,
just because I'm pretty ignorant, can you opt out of the customized search?
yes, you can, right?
And okay,
Yeah.
and you can make that sort of the default for you at a particular
Yeah.
computer.
Once you opt out of it, you can keep out of the personalized search.
So, I mean, can you assume that we're intelligent enough to make these decisions? I mean, do we?
It's not about intelligence; it's about informed. You didn't know until you asked that question that you could opt out of it, right?
That's true. But if they made a point of it to explain, would that address? Right. I mean, they would opt you in, but they would make it very clear that you have been opted in, and explain exactly how to avoid that.
And they do. If you, like me, read the official Google blog regularly, then you are aware of that.
No, but I mean, if they made it more prominent, would that address your?
Oh, yeah, almost. If they made it more prominent. So I don't know how much more prominent you could make it without.
Just suppose it was on their
okay, well,
nothing else but that on their big.
They have no incentive to make it more prominent.
Okay. Okay,
right?
I'm saying that could you have the opt-in model, which allows them to collect a lot of stuff without a lot of argument, but have the opt-out much ingrained in the public understanding? Would that not be? I'm saying there are advantages of opt-out.
Of how it is right now,
Yeah,
yes.
And
There are certainly advantages to Google. I'm not sure there are advantages to us. I would be much happier if when Google institutes something like personalized search, it said to us, click here to get personalized search, and here's why it'll make your life better. And that, to me, would be an actual level of responsibility that Google has not achieved. I don't expect Google to do that. There's no incentive to do that, right? There's no incentive for Google to ask us to opt into their system. They will continue to tell us it's better for us. But really, unless you're the sort of person who obsesses about this company and reads the Google blog all the time, or reads work by people who read the Google blog, you're not going to know about it. And you're not even going to know that personalized search is going on. And I think that's pretty much the case. Now, if everybody read my book, I think the world would be a better place too. That's not going to happen. So in the absence of that, that's one of the reasons I think we need to have a lot of these discussions at the level of the state. We actually have to have our representatives engaged with these issues. And I may lose the argument, but at least we will have had the argument. I was so much happier losing an argument at the level of public discourse than just never having it.
I'm interested to hear what you think of Eric Schmidt's handling of the 2010 Street View case, where Google collected Wi-Fi data without permission,
Yeah.
especially in light of what you said about corporate social responsibility.
Yeah, okay, so this was weird, and I've never had a really good explanation. So when Google was sending its cars around to take the images that became Google Street View, and this was happening both in Western Europe and in North America, its cars were picking up data from open Wi-Fi hubs. So they collected a lot of private data, passwords, logins, stuff that was floating around, and they kept it. They kept it in its servers. Google's never been clear about who made this happen, who ordered it, who set up the system and why they kept it. And of course, European privacy regulators were furious, and they still are furious, and it's one of the reasons that Germany has been pressuring Google to expunge this data. I think Google ultimately did expunge data, but Google's basically giving up on Street View in Germany, not going to update the system anymore because dealing with German officials has been too difficult. Google's never fully explained it, and Schmidt's never fully explained why they did this, except to say it was a mistake, we're sorry. It just seemed like too elaborate a system to be just a mistake. But Google's never explained what value that data would have presented to, and I'm not convinced there is value in it. I think here's part of the problem. When you go around saying to yourself and to others that you won't be evil, at some point it slips easily into you can do no wrong. And that's what I mean by hubris or superbia, right? This notion that things that emanate from Mountain View, California, from this company are in the service of good things in the world, can trick you, can give you a false sense of your own purpose, and make you a little bit careless about how you do things. So the Google Buzz issue is a perfect example. You, like me, were likely drawn into a social network you didn't ask to join. About a year ago, was it about a year ago? Maybe a little bit longer than that. Google suddenly launched this social network called Buzz, and it was an adjunct to Gmail. And what it did was it took your Gmail address book and created a social network for you and created followers for you out of your social network. At no point were you asked to join. You were ostensibly given the option to opt out, but even the opting out was almost impossible to do. It was a big mess. It was a disaster. One of the basic mistakes Google made with Buzz was assuming that the rest of us treat our Gmail contacts the way that people at Google do, right? Because for most of us, for many of us, even it doesn't have to be most of us, it could be 10 of us, Gmail is not our primary email. Maybe we had a Yahoo account long before that. Maybe we have our work email, right? Our Stanford.edu email as our primary email. But we use Gmail for other things, internet dating, right? Or to be on listservs. or, and this is a really important one, to go find the next job, right? That's the email you put on your resume that you send around so that inquiries don't come to your company email, right? Or in the case of one woman who had used Gmail to contact her abusive ex-spouse to work out the separation terms. And all of a sudden, her abusive ex-spouse had a vision of all of her contacts through this, right? That sort of embarrassing situation is why the Federal Trade Commission fined Google heavily a month ago. And Google had to agree to regular privacy audits for the next 20 years. It's the sort of thing that Google never would have done had people there not been in such a bubble and not been so convinced in their righteousness. And so I started the book thinking that don't be evil didn't matter. And I ended the book thinking it actually matters in a weird way that I don't think is healthy.
I understand that the primary purpose of the book was more to look at Google's place in the public sphere or the corporate sphere in its relation to these large institutions. But I'm wondering, vis-a-vis its impact on ordinary people. You mentioned, I think, Nicholas Carr's book, Is Google Making Us Stupid? And that, or article rather, and that does seem like, a very I guess, one-sided position. But I am wondering, you mentioned there's a sort of tension between, you said that Google on the one hand is very good at serving us, but on the other hand, they're also very good at giving us what we think we want.
Right.
And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on precisely what Google is doing at an individual level in terms of shaping behavior, shaping ideas, perhaps moving us in directions that we won't be so comfortable with in 10 years, say.
Yeah, that's tough to measure. Actually, anything about search engines is tough to measure, especially a search engine that changes as often. So in terms of Google's effect on us individually, I don't want to overstate my concern, but my concern is something like the fact that by using Google as an adjunct to our own judgment, we find our own processes melded with the algorithmic values and methods of Google, right? So if I'm using Google every day as a crutch for memory and a crutch for thought, it doesn't, as Carr would argue, make me less capable of remembering or of thinking. I think he's off on that. But it does change the nature of how I think and what I remember. It means that what I choose to focus on remembering is going to be influenced by my comfort level with Google, right? And this does happen, right? I know I can't tell you my mother's phone number. I'm sorry, Mom, I can't. I think I can remember like 4 of the digits, but I don't have to. And I know I don't have to because it's in every mobile phone I've had for the last 10 years, right? So for the last 10 years, since she moved to Florida, I haven't had to. And so I don't. Now, it's not that I'm not capable. This is where Carr's wrong, right? Nick Carr, who is a very smart, provocative guy, wants to argue that these technologies are limiting our capacities. I don't think so. I think we're just lazy people, lazy animals, and it's giving us a chance to focus on other things, right? So I don't remember my mom's phone number, but I can tell you that Babe Ruth had a .342 batting average. That's also something I could look up on Google if I wanted to, but I'd rather have it, right? There's things I would rather have in my mind. So it does help structure what you choose to remember, what you choose to rely on Google for. And it does mean that some of the things you explore about the world are going to be influenced by the choices Google makes for us. I can't diagnose it on an individual level, but this is a concern I have. I think Carr is misguided in 2 ways. One, he considers the plasticity of the human mind to be operative only in the degradation, right? So I think he forgets that we're plastic enough that while we may find ourselves unable to read a 300-page book by Tolstoy 1 week, it doesn't mean we won't be able to read it in 3 months if we decide to. That's where I think Carr misses the boat. He also, there's a much larger story about the technological determinism at work in Carr's work, which I resist. But that's as far as I want to take it. That we have to beware of cotton candy, right? I mean, we have to beware of cotton candy, right? We have to beware of candy, and sometimes Google's given us candy. Not always. Google actually does some pretty helpful things, right? When you're hurt, you need a crutch. When you're not hurt, you don't necessarily need a crutch.
Thanks for a fascinating talk. I'm curious if you can use the current Google Books vis-a-vis Yale University's decision to digitize their both libraries and museums for free as an example of how Google works with another entity. Say Google Books has dealt with 60 plus universities. To how cooperative is Google? Why isn't Google engaging Yale directly? I ask this because I'm developing World University in School, like Wikipedia in 281 languages with MIT OpenCourseWare, free, open, potentially all museums, all libraries that have substantial content online. How does Google work with such entities like Yale?
I can't answer that because I've never been involved in those sorts of discussions, either with Google or with librarians who are having that kind of frustration. I'm really not down with the details on that. I'm sorry. That's all I can say. I wish I knew more about Yale's particular situation. I do know that this is one of the reasons, and dealing with OpenCourseWare and dealing with Wikipedia-based or wiki-based projects, I think we need a much more cohesive global vision for how to build an information ecosystem for the next 50 years. And I think we lack that vision. And that's what I would really like to see. So the conclusion of my book is called The Human Knowledge Project, in which I argue that we should step back and say that we're less interested in what we can get our hands on in the next 36 months and be more interested in what sort of information ecosystem we can build over the next 50 years and leave to people who are not yet born. I think that, as I said earlier, we have the capacity now to make sure that a 12-year-old in South Africa has access to as much high-quality information as a 12-year-old in Sweden or Canada. We have the ability to do that. We don't have the political will to do that. I think it would be a nice thing. In fact, a brilliant thing. I think it should be something we strive for. But I also think we have to strive for it politically. I think the worst thing in the world is to sit back and say, well, maybe a big rich company will do it for us. Now, that I think it's good, it doesn't mean everyone thinks it's a good idea. I would like, again, to engage politically and say, hey, everybody, if you think this is a good idea, get on board. Let's come up with a vision. Let's come up with a set of an agenda of laws that need to be changed, money that needs to be raised, technology that needs to be laid out there. And if it fails, right? If we can't convince the powerful people in the world that this is a good idea, then we just don't deserve it. That, I think, is a responsible, engaged, political way to approach fixing something in the world. What really bugs me about our relationship with Google is the notion that we rely on it to be a savior, that Google will fix something. And part of the background of this came from a conversation where I was talking to a professor at a very well-known and wealthy liberal arts college in New England, who had been on the committee that had designed their fabulous new university library. And for several months, there was one member of the board of trustees who was agreeing to allow for the construction of this new library. And the reason was he was convinced that we don't need libraries because we have Google. And I've heard that sort of notion expressed by people both powerful and powerless for years. You never hear a poor person say that, of course, because poor people go to libraries all the time. But you see people outside of the university community, people who don't need libraries because they're wealthy enough, say those sorts of things. I think it's a severe misreading of both the role of Google and the role of libraries. And so the sort of the backstory and the backhanded nature of my book is to get us to recognize the value of public institutions like libraries. Actually, explicitly libraries, not just public institutions like them, because that's where we can see Republican values work through and get realized, and that's where we can see communities come together and see people connect with knowledge, both collaboratively and individually, and when we need it, secretly.
So my question is about public affairs and accountability. Google's been compared to being some sort of whipping boy by the see recently, and the problem was that it's getting in league with, say, like your Walmarts and that sort of thing. If we regulate the internet, we got to regulate all of it, and it's an all or none policy. And we're going through lots of privacy regulation, lots of burgeoning internet and privacy law right now. There's a lot of disagreement about how this should happen. If you look at a company like Google, they're like a campus of knowledge. And is there a way to more or less get the people to do it through alt media or through, say, a Google bureau, so that we could possibly opt out of other things and kind of provide our own accountability rather than relying on the government, which is also very bad on privacy policy, by the way?
No. And the reason is that you would have to actually affect change. A non-state-based movement would have to achieve critical mass. And to achieve critical mass, you would have to articulate very technical things in a clear enough fashion to generate a movement to something. And to what is unanswerable. It's not like there is a search engine out there that doesn't track people. It's not like there's a search engine out there that would actually behave more responsibly than Google. Google's actually about the most responsible web company out there. And has actually done us a lot less harm than it could have, and done us very little harm, actually. That's one of the reasons it's a fascinating company, right? If I wanted to argue an alarmist, if I wanted to make an alarmist argument and pillory a company, then Facebook would have been so much easier and a lot less interesting, because Facebook doesn't necessarily structure knowledge the same way. Facebook plays other really important roles that are both positive and troublesome. Now, that the government is bad about privacy is true, and that's why we have to fight that politically too. That the government abuses its position in terms of its surveillance, well, yeah, and that's why we have to fight that politically. In fact, that's part of the same political movement. I like to think of it, in fact, beyond privacy as dignity. We really have to start a dignity movement in this country that has to address powerful institutions, both state and private, and make it clear that having a certain level of anonymity and breathing room and ability to be forgiven for one's youthful indiscretions is part of both being human and being social. And I don't think we have that. I don't think we fully articulated that. But I don't see such an effort of collective action actually having a place to go beyond Google. Now, the state is not one thing, right? While the state does monitor us to an uncomfortable and I would argue unconstitutional degree, that doesn't mean that other aspects of the state can't be invoked to protect us. The state does contradictory things. The state funds cancer research and tobacco farms, right? So that the state is contradictory doesn't teach us anything. It's always been contradictory. It always works at cross purposes. But the effects can be positive or negative. It's our job as citizens to keep the state straightforward and consistent when we can. We also work in a system that does not have cohesiveness or unanimity of opinion. So we're always going to get contradiction and we're always going to get slippage and ebb and flow in what we're trying to protect.
Please join me in thanking Siva Vaidhyanathan for a wonderful talk. He will be signing books right outside this room for the next few minutes.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.